Hello, I'm Rachel Bradley, and in this video I'm going to be talking you through the process behind my painting of my character Elle, with a focus on making smart design decisions and conveying character. Now, I don't know about you, but for me the hardest part of the painting process is making decisions. The act of committing to very strong, very deliberate decisions early on so that you don't spend the whole painting process faffing around and making a mess, that's definitely one of my weaknesses. But there are ways to counter it, there are ways to work around it, and I hope that in this video I can show you kind of techniques, ways to be more confident in the decisions you're making and ways to make better decisions. So with that, let's get started. Now, the absolute most important thing I have to do at this stage when I'm starting a new piece like this is find good reference. I never thought reference was that important. I thought I could skip past it, I thought I knew what I was doing, but guaranteed I always had a worse time when I didn't use reference. On screen here you can see the reference picture I was working from, this is my face, and you can access that and many more from reference.pictures. At this stage in the painting I'm working very loosely. I know that I want Elle to be the kind of focus of this. I don't want it to be a very literal piece, I want it to kind of tell her character. So we're working on a sort of centered but kind of stylized composition. Elle is a very confident, playful, sunny kind of character, and so my priority is conveying that. I decided to keep to a very strict colour palette of greens and oranges to keep it kind of looking bright and outdoorsy. Before I get too far into rendering, I just want to get those colours right. Let's just spare a thought for poor past Rachel who thought that adding an elf ear to this would make it better. We're just going to pretend like that's not there and just carry on. I have what I affectionately refer to as a very back and forth process. So I don't just do all the line art in one pass, then all the colour in one pass, all the shading in one pass. I tend to work on different layers and kind of go back and forth to make sure everything's balanced. At this point we finally say goodbye to the elf ear and commit to actually painting poor Elle. So here I'm kind of feeling comfortable with the overall colour harmony of the piece, so I'm allowing myself to get into rendering, which helps me visualise the rest of things. It gives me a little bit of direction. Getting into rendering allows me to see errors in proportions that I hadn't previously noticed. You'll also see that I'm flipping the canvas back and forth, which helps me spot those proportion errors. I've got that bound on my keyboard to Control F, and I make sure to do it as often as I can. At this stage I'm paying much more attention to my edges, so you'll see that I'm varying them up a fair bit. I've got very crisp lines around the eyes and nose and the kind of prominent focal features, but I'm working very softly on the shading on her cheeks and her skin. Balancing hard and soft edges in your brushwork is a really useful tool in making your work look much more professional. When we first get started we tend to lean one way or the other, work too mushy or work too hard. Learning how to control those edges is a really important thing. You'll also see that now I've rendered a little bit, I can see some errors in the overall contrast, in the values that I'm using. So I allow myself to go back in and darken the shadow areas so there's a little bit more contrast in there. One of the ways in which I can emphasise in this painting her playful nature is using those lines of the hair to kind of indicate motion through the whole piece. The tilting of her expression and the swooping round of the hair kind of has this continuous S-shaped curve going through it, which just makes it look more harmonious and in motion. At this point I'm feeling kind of confident with the rendering on the face, and I feel like it's time to move on and start adding more details on the lower part of the painting now I know that the top's looking kind of as I want it to. Painting faces is certainly my comfort zone, which is why you'll see me putting off the lower half of the painting until I know what I've done with the top half. This ultimately again comes down to just forcing yourself to make decisions. I went and found a really strong reference image for the hands and knew that I just had to at some point commit to sketching it, commit to drawing it, and commit to painting it. If you're guilty of faffing around like me in a painting and kind of noodling on one area before you've even touched another part, you probably are the same as me in that you just need to force yourself to sit down and make these decisions. Break them down into logical steps, so it's not just, figure out the bottom half of the painting. It becomes find reference, draw a sketch, break it down into logical steps so it's less of a mystical, scary sort of thing. This was a very experimental painting for me. I've recently been doing a lot of studies, and so I had a lot of things that I've learned that I needed to apply to it. As such, the whole process is a little bit scattered, but that's okay. I thought it might make for an interesting video to see the very honest, very raw thoughts, mistakes, changes that go into this piece, because a lot of what we see is very polished, very definite, and it's not always that way. Here you can see me back and forthing, like I previously mentioned. So now that there's a bit more rendering in the bottom half of the painting, I can see ways in which I can push the top. So this is where working on different layers is really valuable, because it means I can just go in and tweak things without damaging everything. And it allows me to design on the fly like this. So quite often I can't really visualize how something is going to look until it's down on the canvas. Having a well-rendered reference point there with the face just kind of allows me to visualize a little bit more clearly. My mind's eye isn't that strong, so basically I will try with different designs on top of the painting on a different layer and just play with it until I found something that I really like. I'm also making sure not to destroy the previous gradients that I came up with of the more warm colouring at the top of the painting and this kind of greeny, yellowy shading at the bottom. So with a very soft and low opacity brush, I apply that same green to the lower part of this leather piece and the same orange to the upper part, just to make sure that I'm keeping to the original plan. Often while I'm painting, I can find myself losing my way. I'll become distracted, I'll feel like I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be doing with the painting. That's usually like a warning bell for me. It means that I'm not thinking carefully enough. It means I'm kind of turning my brain off and I'm noodling and I'm not paying attention to very specific things in the painting. I have to force myself to pay careful attention to the fundamentals one by one, make sure that I am not skipping any corners in terms of drawing, make sure that I haven't at any point ruined the colours or pushed the values in the wrong direction. So if you ever find yourself kind of noodling, kind of umming and ahhing and not really moving forward, break it down, look at things one by one, decide if it's your drawing that's the problem, if it's the colours that are the problem, if your values are wrong, and breaking it up into these very tangible, real things and less kind of just a mushy, I don't really know what's going wrong in this painting, helps a whole lot. My much more experimental process in this also means I've made much more of a mess. So thankfully working on different layers makes that a little bit easier to clean up, but I have to make sure that, you know, and I've been moving things around and scaling things and colouring on different layers, that I'm not creating a mess. I have to just be very careful and spend time going around things, neatening things up once I've made a definite decision. Here you'll see me kind of revisiting the face and seeing that the eyebrows were much softer than everything else. They kind of looked out of balance to me, so I went back around them with a hard outline and made them match the rest of the face. At this point in the painting, I think I'm hitting a home run. So I've finally fixed any anatomy issues I had. I fixed drawing issues. I am happy with the design of the collar around her neck. I'm happy with the feathers in her hair. At this point, there are very few decisions left to make on her character design. It's pretty much just rendering from here on, which is a really happy place to reach, honestly. It's my comfort zone, rendering. It means I don't have to make so many decisions. I honestly could have reached this much sooner in the painting, but such is the nature of working very experimentally and on the fly. The trouble with this very pure rendering phase is that it can be kind of dull compared to everything else. Once you get to switch your brain off, suddenly it's just a long time of just making everything neat. I would encourage you to really slow down, really pay careful attention, spend longer on it than you think you have to. Sloppy rendering really does show, especially when, in my case, I spent so much longer on the face than anything else. I then have to balance that on the less interesting areas like the hand and the clothing folds, but I challenge you to always just push yourself a little bit further than you think you have to. Always just spend a little bit longer than you think you have to. We're always eager to get a piece finished as quickly as we can, but I guarantee that, especially in the long run, in like a month's time or a year's time, you're going to regret much more spending too little time on it than too much time. And in reaching the final stages of rendering the character at this point, I'm just making sure that the tail end of her hair is reflecting the same S-curve that I mentioned before in the rest of the painting. That's just a really nice way of balancing the whole composition. Aha, now we move on to the background. So ordinarily I wouldn't recommend painting a character in isolation like this and then working on the background. If you're going for a more realistic effect, that was a really good way to make your character look very cut out and not part of the background. But in this case, cut out is exactly what I wanted. I wanted it to be a very kind of artsy, non-realistic representation of Elle, and I wanted these background elements to really fit her, not the other way around. So I wouldn't normally recommend doing this, but it worked well specifically for this piece. I only had a very vague idea of what I wanted the background to look like. It was much more of a feeling. I knew that I wanted it to balance out the painting, complement it. So here you can see me painting these bright coloured curves just to make sure that the elements I'm painting kind of follow that same curve that I mentioned before, the same motion through the piece. I didn't want it to conflict it. I wanted it to be subtle and hidden behind and complementing it. Another way I knew I could prevent the background from competing with the foreground is by keeping those values much tighter. So I knew that I could get all the detail in that I wanted, but if I started pushing the contrast too heavily, we'd end up with a kind of very busy, very messy kind of scene. Right here, I'm working very dark, much darker than the final will be, mostly just so I can make sure that the shapes and silhouettes are strong, and then I will use a clipping layer to apply a lighter colour over the top so it doesn't compete. I'm working from a combination of reference of acacia trees and of paintings by Alphonse Mucha. So I'm kind of using some of his design elements applied to photo studies from acacia trees. And at this point I'm kind of happy with the balance of the colours, of the shapes. It's time to move in and start rendering. I put the line art and the shading on 2 different layers. So it allows me to work back and forth to make sure everything's balanced. I also applied the shading with a clipping mask, as I mentioned before. That allows me to shade it as I go and not mess up the colours. So I don't have to worry about getting that gradient perfect. I've already got that. And I'm working more with the shape than the colour here. Keeping those 2 layers separate makes it much easier to change the colours later. So I said that the priority of the background here is not to compete with the foreground. Putting those 2, the line art and the shading, on different layers means that I can easily tweak them, bring them back if I need to afterwards. I'm obviously working very imaginatively with these. They're very, very stylized. So I found that working in big shapes down to smaller shapes helps. So you'll see that I have these great big messy blocks underneath, and that I'm slowly kind of chiseling away at them, adding the details in. If I were to just draw those straight off the bat with no guidance underneath, I might find that I end up disrupting the overall balance of the piece. But working from those big shapes down really helps to keep everything balanced. Now that I have some background in there, it meant that I could kind of revisit L a little bit and see how much contrast I could push. I have a tendency to be too contrasty in my paintings, so in this piece I really pushed myself to keep the contrast low, and the nice thing is that towards the end of the painting I could push it further if I wanted to. Now I just have to match the style of the other side, which I really liked, on this side, which was much harder, but I actually really enjoyed this part. It was much more cathartic than all the decision-making stuff I had to make earlier. I've always rather liked this stage. Now that the sides match, I allow myself the subtlest of shading, just ever so slight, not to compete with the foreground, but just to give a little bit of interest to those trees. I also want these feathers in the bottom to finish off that S-curve at the bottom that I mentioned before. So working in a very, very low opacity, I draw in those feathers and it just finishes off the whole piece, balancing out the composition and making sure that motion continues all the way from the bottom up to the top. In the final moments here, I notice that the whole composition is a little bit shifted. L looks a little bit off balance. I just push those things in and just make sure that everything is lined up and that nothing is kind of pulling the whole composition off. And here's the result. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you really enjoyed it. I will put a link to the reference pictures I mentioned in the description below. And if you enjoyed it, please hit subscribe and like, and I'll see you at some point.